So we're here in Washington, D.C. on the 21st of June, 2024. My name is Thandeka Dlamini. I am with Mamadi. Yilla. Yes, Yilla. Yes. To do an interview for the oral history, the global history for PEPFAR. At this time, 1416. So we are just going to start off by asking you to briefly tell us about yourself and your family. Where were you born and where did you go to school?
So thank you for that. And it's a privilege, it's an honor to be a part of this project. My name is Mamadi Yilla, and I was born in a little town called Bo in Sierra Leone in West Africa. I went to school there, then went to school in the UK and came to the United States to go to college. And today I am married. I am the mother of 3 daughters who are off to graduate school this summer. And I have been involved in PEPFAR since 2006. When I went to serve as the PEPFAR country coordinator in Malawi in the very early days of the program there. I spent 5 years in country, and then the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, Eric Gooseby, was in country for a visit for a week. And when I went to see him off at the airport, he said, "I want you to come work for me in Washington." And that's actually how I got here.
Oh, interesting. So I'd just like to ask you to backtrack a bit. How do you become a candidate to be posted in Malawi, PEPFAR for that instance? How did you get into the HIV field?
How did it happen?
Yes.
So I was a bench scientist at the CDC. I was doing work. I had finished my postdoc at MIT. I had gotten a job at CDC. I was employed in the measles virus section of in what was equivalent to the National Center for Infectious Diseases there. And my husband was one of the 5 people at the CDC who started the Global AIDS Program that was CDC's arm of PEPFAR. And he was going to take an overseas position and was sort of analyzing which different countries we might go to. And he had a choice between Malawi and Rwanda. And I had just watched Hotel Rwanda. This is just how idiotic I was back then. And I was like, maybe we won't go there. Let's go to Malawi. But I was also a CDC employee, and he was going to go be the NIH chief of party. He was going to be the NIH chief of party and CDC director. So it was not going to be possible for me to continue to work for CDC. And as a female professional, that really troubled me, that I was not going to be a trailing spouse, and I needed my own job. I had a PhD, I was a scientist. And so I was told about this potential position by someone that I'll call one of the godfathers of PEPFAR, R.J. Simons. And he actually helped me identify this PEPFAR country coordinator role. At the time, it was ill-defined. Nobody was really sure exactly what I was going to do. And at the time, I was the chairperson of the parent council at my children's daycare at CDC. And he said, "I think it's going to be something like that. You will have to herd the cats." And I was like, who are the cats we're referring to? But that's actually how I ended up in Malawi. I interviewed for the position, and it's part of my PEPFAR story, the fact that I went to serve in this program in a country where I had the extraordinary challenge that my spouse was part of the interagency team that I would lead. I'm both proud of the fact that that our marriage survived that kind of challenge, of me being the PEPFAR country coordinator, but it was the job of a lifetime, and ended up being an incredible experience. But that's literally how I got there. I was doing very different kind of work. I was in the lab running a flow cytometer most of the days, and ended up with this unbelievable opportunity.
It's a very interesting.
You're going to cut all of that out that I said about my husband.
No, not at all. Not at all. I was
on the Oprah show once. I talked too much, and I was just praying to God that Oprah would cut out all the things that I said.
No, I was just going to say that that human aspect, that personal aspect of the story is very important to us. Because we are always telling the story of the metrics and how important PEPFAR has been to save lives. But personally, what's the kind of the personal story you can tell about it? So that one is really nice. We enjoy that aspect. So now we are moving from the lab into forefront of PEPFAR implementation.
Yes.
In a foreign country you've never been. How was that like for you?
So very good question, right? Because I was born in Africa, and I thought I was going to the motherland. And I got to Malawi, and it was, in some ways, it felt like I was in a foreign country, because I didn't realize how different that part of Africa was. And I'll tell you very specifically, I come from West Africa, where you land at the airport, people start inviting you to their house to come eat something. It took me a year before I entered anyone's house in Malawi, which took me by surprise, because that just wasn't the culture. And so that was the first sort of like, okay, I'm somewhere different, and it's probably going to be a little bit harder to get to know people. And also what happened in that first year, I was trying to understand the culture, so that we were given this task. And when I got to Malawi, we had our ambassador, Alan Eastham, made every new person go on a sort of a visit to this place called Mua Mission. And Mua Mission was run by a Catholic priest who was Italian, and I don't know how he ended up in these deep villages in Malawi. But we went to Mua Mission to understand the culture that we had come to work in, to understand what Malawian culture was. And it was a very eye-opening thing, because I'd been given this task. You guys are supposed to help end AIDS. So we go there with all this enthusiasm about, the work. And the priest goes, listen, you people come here, one day it's malaria, the other day it's TB. And it's like, we don't have an emergency here. This is just life. But it was a very sobering moment for me to understand that, no, this is not a project. These are people's lives. We've come to do something very important. I remember the drive into Lilongwe, just the number of coffin shops that were lining the streets in those days, and recognizing that, oh my gosh, there's something really serious happening here. But that entry into the country in that manner, that basically kind of said, okay, let's explain a little bit about where you've come. My expectation that I was returning home to the motherland, but that's not actually what it was going to be like. That I was also an African who was now an American, and navigating that space. What I will say about sort of that movement from being tasked with what it was I was supposed to do in terms of this interagency program, trying to understand the government and the people of Malawi, and getting myself immersed in that work. And I think this is also some of what one of the reasons why I have the kind of passion that I have about having been involved in this program for the last 18 years, is that I am a daughter of the continent, and my adopted land was coming to save people's lives that they had no clue who they were. So I found myself in this space where I could challenge government about, hey, other people are here trying to do this for you. And at the same time, from our side, kind of like, listen, this is not a project. People aren't our project. right? We are actually trying to build relationships here. And it was always clear to me when I got to Malawi that we came to do something and then we were going to go home. And I think that spurred me on. So when we, it was always, oh, we're here to do capacity building. And that was a very interesting terminology for me at that time, because it was like the people we went to help, they actually knew how to do a lot of things for themselves too, right? It was just, did you have opportunity? Did you have resources? Did you have know-how? So I quickly vested myself in basically trying to understand. There's a famous thing people say in Malawi, when Malawians say yes for everything. So you have to ask, is this a yes, yes, or it's a yes, no? And that changed my my success rate, because I was very, very honest with people. So I know what you just said, but is that true?
Yeah.
Or is that just the answer you give the donors, that kind of thing? But anyway, let me pause there.
Okay. Very rich insight. I mean, I'm really enjoying like how you position yourself and like your very own unique experience in all of that. I mean, I was just gonna ask, like, so at what point were you able to break off? What was the thing, the moment whereby you were able to figure this out, where
Good
all of
question.
this made sense,
Yes.
because
Yes.
you come and it's like treading on
Yes.
eggshells and
Sure.
you're like, it's so different. I thought I
Sure.
had everything figured, but not. What was the breakthrough point for
So
you?
Lily Banda. So Lily Banda was the head of, she was one of the leaders. So she was one of the senior Malawians in the embassy at USAID. And I remember going to her office and just saying, I was frustrated. I felt like I wasn't getting traction and didn't quite know how to configure what we were trying to do, because here we were USG, but we were many agencies. We had all these partners. I mean, in those first early days, we didn't have as much because we only had $18 million at that time. Today, Malawi's budget is $170 million a year for PEPFAR, but didn't know quite how to gain traction. So I went to see Lily, and she said to me, you need to go see Bridget. I said, who's Bridget? She said, Bridget Chibwana. She's the deputy at the National AIDS Commission. You need to go talk to her. And that was the day my life changed in Malawi, because Bridget explained her country to me.
Yeah.
Bridget helped me to understand where the centers of power were, how things actually worked in the country, how decisions were made, who got to talk a lot but didn't really have authority, who had the real authority. And she became my partner for the next 4 years that I was in the country. I took a lot of my steer from her. I left Malawi in 2011, and for 8 years I had no connection to the country. And then in 2018, we had someone depart the program here, and I was asked, would I actually consider taking Malawi on as a country and providing the oversight. So in February or so of 2019, I had this unbelievable pleasure
To go back.
of returning. And sometimes I feel like I had a special gift that was given to me, because I had been a part of pulling this thing together, and then we said our goodbyes, and then I got to go back, and I cannot tell you what it's like. I was there in February, and I asked people to stand up who had served with me, and there were about 5 people in the room who got up, and it was pretty cool, because I remember all of us growing up in our career. So, the person who was the young whatever is now the branch chief.
Yeah.
And I said to them, I said, that's the legacy of PEPFAR for me. That when people look at, you can talk about the life saved and whatnot. I said, but really for me, the legacy is the incredible local staff who are competent and could run things. If they had the resources and the opportunity, they could help elevate the health sector in their country. That's how good they are. And so the privilege for me to actually get to see that, I'll be forever grateful for.
I'm laughing. Maybe after camera time, I will say why. So now you come to Malawi for the first time, and there's a pandemic, an emergency. It's like a death sentence at that point. So how was the situation back then? I mean, what was the state of the government, the health system, the response to HIV/AIDS, if at all, that you found in the country?
So I had a remarkable partner. His name was Biswick Mwale. And Biswick was in charge of the National AIDS Commission. And he was like a force of nature type individual. You know, he'd be running up and down in that Ministry of Health, but basically saying, you know, I need to get these people to act. And, you know, he was constantly putting some other emergency committee together and working group together. And it was an inspiration for me, because I had a Malawian for whom this mattered more than it mattered to anybody else. And it was an important, because the character of the country is not, people are not loud and boisterous publicly. You know, people would always say to me, we celebrate differently when you guys are not around. But in our formal setting, Biswick was a force. And he was basically, you know, instigating action because things were not going well. We had a particular situation where Malawi had received the largest ever Global Fund grant when the Global Fund had started. And by the time I got to country, this grant hadn't actually been implemented yet, because the Global Fund used to have these things called conditions precedent. The country had signed on to all these conditions, but then it wasn't able to fulfill those conditions. So no money had actually come into the country to do a lot of the programming, buy the drugs that were necessary. So you had both the crisis of people who were dying from this disease and resources to do something about it. Now, I can look back when we look at the data, and you can see that by the time we got to Malawi, they were at some of the highest levels of death from HIV/AIDS. And the introduction of the Global Fund resources that bought the life-saving commodities, and how the curve started to go down. Now, in those days, what we were doing was tracking how many people were alive and on treatment. And there was a crew in the country who had been led by a guy named Tony Harris, who was a British doctor who had come to Malawi to do TB. And he basically took his TB approach and said, we're going to move antiretroviral therapy throughout this country. We don't have the machines. We don't have the equipment to test people's blood and all this stuff. We're just going to go out there and start giving people medicine. And that's basically what they did. And they started just capturing people to the point that if there are approximately 1.2 million people who are infected with HIV today in Malawi, some, 960,000, almost 1 million people are on life-saving therapy. Now, it's not the same group of people, but basically that was the progress they made to get medicine to people to help suppress the virus. So the opportunity to have seen that in those days, how things started, Malawi loved to be the first. So one of the amazing things, because small nation, they're not rich, they're not a rich nation, but they had a lot of ambition in terms of, once they started to save lives in this fashion, wanted to do more. So when there was option B offered for pregnant women, they were, first in line to make that happen. But one of the things that I think I must say about those days, and to some degree, a lot of it hasn't changed. The secrecy about HIV and being infected with HIV. And as I was preparing for this project, some of what I was amazed by were the lives that we lost in those days. The colleague from WHO who we all sat in meetings with, the colleague from the World Bank, and then you just hear, oh, so and so died of HIV, and you're like, what? You know, we're involved in this work. We're trying to get antiretroviral therapy to people, but some of the people we're working with were not disclosing. People would go to South Africa to go get their ARVs, so they wouldn't be seen getting medicine. And I was saying to myself the other day that I don't remember in all of the years that I've been affiliated with Malawi where someone of importance or someone known has actually said, I have HIV. The biggest deal was that, I would actually publicly get tested. The Minister of Health would go get tested. So, right? And but to actually disclose, so was a big secret. But so we would get these deaths that would happen. And there was a young boy called Chippy who, I think when I first met Chippy, one of my colleagues had taken him on like her little son. So he was always at our events. He'd been born HIV positive. He was aware of his status, and he was a survivor. So I saw him in those early years as this really young kid. And then when his sort of adopted mother left Malawi and went to Mozambique, she basically said, take care of him for me. So he was always in my space, and just like an old man in this little child body. He didn't live, he died. But his storyline was a very important one for my children because they did not really understand HIV, but they knew this was something that Malawi was dealing with. And Chippy, for all of the access to antiretroviral therapy, he didn't make it in the end. And by the time he died, he was probably around 14, 15. But what a soldier he was. And he was our conscience in many ways. He was our conscience. So we never saw the adults disclose, but we definitely got to see HIV in that experience with Chippy.
Quite remarkable experience right there. Okay, so then in terms of getting out of the office, government, like civil society, faith-based organizations, who are the role players that were in the front line of the response as you come in? I just also want to ask a question.
Sure.
Was PEPFAR the first time when you came when it was introduced, or there had been a previous coordinator before you?
So I was the first coordinator. In fact, the person who happens to be the same person that I was describing in terms of Chippy's mentor, she was the SI advisor with CDC. It was a very small team. The majority of the money was resources that came through USAID. And then CDC had about $3 million that they were trying to initiate some work with the Ministry of Health with.
So I think now what we're moving on to was to describe the fact that how did you find the response stakeholders,
to be?
Yes, and who are at the front line of the HIV response as PEPFAR was just starting up in Malawi.
So I think that so PEPFAR, so Malawi was one of what were described then as non-focus countries. So PEPFAR had launched pretty much around 2004. It's 15 focus countries. So those were the programs in South Africa, in Zambia, in Mozambique, Tanzania, big programs, Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire. Then there were the 5 sort of non-focus countries. Malawi was one of them, Lesotho, Swaziland. And the effort there was much smaller in scale. And in fact, if you know a lot about PEPFAR, you know about our famous country operational plan process, which was how everybody got around the table to discuss what those resources would do. So in those days, we didn't actually write a country operational plan. We did a little activity to sort of explain. And so we were very keen to become one of the countries who did a country operational plan, because that's how you were likely to get substantive resources. So I think very much in those days, it was trying to understand the landscape with other donors, what they were doing. The National AIDS Commission was bringing us together as a multi-sectoral response. We had civil society's voice, faith-based groups, the nursing sector, all kinds of people coming around the table. It was largely to have a conversation about the Global Fund resources and the things that were not happening. But, there was this money for the country, but it wasn't coming in. What did we need to do to make that happen? And that we came in more like technical assistants because we didn't have big programs. And in those days, honestly, I think that it was a mixture between what have I kind of like gotten into? Like I was a scientist, but I worked in the bench. I did even the concept of programs. When I had been a bench scientist, I did not know where my supplies came from. Didn't ever think about, well, where was the money and who was buying what. And then all of a sudden I was in this very transactional space. And to this day, this is a pet peeve of mine with the culture, because everything became very transactional. And it was like, okay, so what, we need to do some kind of work together. Well, who's paying for it? And I was like, well, wait a minute, isn't this your job? What do you mean who's paying for it? So there was a lot of this per diem and that storyline, very much that introduction to that was a tough thing for me because I just didn't understand we're here to help, right? So why does it feel like you're trying to and I think this is one of the amazing things about the opportunity that was PEPFAR, because the US government made a decision, propelled by outside forces. There were definitely a lot of the faith-based groups, the advocacy around doing something, the Congressional Black Caucus around doing something about all of this generation of people who were dying in Africa, and to go do something about that. And so the fact that we were there, even though we were not there in a large scale, but we could see potential. And if we just had a little bit more resource, we could really have the ability to influence things. So my first major thing that I did in Malawi was to bring the Global Fund to country, because the relationship had broken down, but those resources were going to be really important. And it was like, how are we going to navigate this relationship? I had a secret weapon at the Global Fund that nobody knew about. My sister's best friend was in charge of the country programs. And once she learned I'd got to Malawi, it was like, well, how can we work together? How can I help you? And I said, your grants are not open. And there's an impasse between the government and you. Can you guys come? So the short of it was that her boss, herself, and the fund portfolio manager, they were a team of 3, were going to come to country. And we were going to organize a series of meetings that week across all sectors and get the Global Fund to come and let's work together. And let's try and figure out how to get these grants signed so that you can start dispersing money. That entire week was me following my instinct in terms of using my boss to help us get the high-level meetings that we needed across all sectors. We had a meeting, I remember, with all of the ambassadors for all the donor countries. And I remember them sitting in this room. They were on one side and the 3 from the Global Fund on the other side, and the Norwegian ambassador going, well, if they're good, if it's good enough for me to put my money in their basket, why is it not good enough for you? Because at that time we had the swap in Malawi, and the sector-wide approach, and money wasn't coming in from the Global Fund. But that week was a real eye-opener for me about the power of relationships. about the power of saying, this is all our problem, and we need to all be together to solve this problem. I remember at the final meeting, we had like a outbrief meeting at the Ministry of Health, and all the people were seated, and I was sitting in the back. And the WR for WHO, she comes to me and she says, look at you hiding in the background as if you have nothing to do with it. But that was my style. I was never eager to be in the forefront. I actually preferred being in the background. I preferred being the wing woman and put my boss in front of this and just leverage my relationships off the stage to actually make progress. And so PEPFAR, and it's our ability to basically say we are a reliable partner. We think that if we get some of these things going, that we can even do more, was a powerful experience for me. And in 2008, when PEPFAR was up for its first reauthorization under Mark Dybul, and Mark Dybul is here in Washington trying to convince people in Congress about how to get another 5-year reauthorization for PEPFAR. And he came up with this sort of like, Congress, if you give us money, this is what we'll ask for from the governments. We will kind of have this partnership approach as opposed to a donor-recipient approach. So we will do this for you, Malawi, government of Malawi, what will you do in turn? And in 2009, Malawi was the first country that published a pioneering partnership framework document. It got us $20 more million. It was the first time our resources were doubled. And I very proudly will say that I wrote that document, not on my own, with my team, but propelled its coming together and happening. And we followed that with an implementation plan. And the beauty of having been around this long is that today, when we are having conversations now around sustainability, which is like our second round at it, but those lessons from Malawi those days continue to be what influences me. The permanent secretary of health at the time, Chris Kangombe, when Washington said we had this potential of getting this $20 million, I went to see him. I said, at this time it's the early part of the first Obama administration, and they were doing this big global health initiative. They were promoting country ownership. We had climate change and all of these sort of like big principles that they were trying to implement. And I sat with Chris Kangombe, and he listened to me, and he said to me, he says, Mamadi, he said, let's talk about joint ownership. He said, it's your money, but it's my country. And you cannot own what you don't pay for. So let's talk about joint ownership. To this day, I live that principle out. I say that to countries all the time. I said, it's very hard for you to accept donor resources and say it won't come with strings attached. It will absolutely come with strings attached. Yeah. So you should be working, because it's not a natural state of play for other people to come and be giving you money to do the things that your citizens need. But I can say that because I'm a daughter of the continent. Nobody's going to accuse me of being colonialist or whatever. I don't look the part. And so I leverage that because it's what I actually believe. I believe that this partnership needs to evolve, and it cannot be that you will be truly free, truly resilient, if you are always needing other people to actually keep your people alive. It's just not a natural state of play. And so that's the challenge, that because science didn't deliver us a cure yet, and it didn't deliver us a vaccine. And so the longer you're in this exercise or this relationship, the more it begins to feel like the norm. And so having dialogue now about, well, we want to change how this is, but it's like, well, you've been here so long doing it this way. Why do you want to change now? So it's a very challenging environment. It doesn't take away the successes, because I know those people who died. A lot of them, the nannies, the whomever who died of HIV in those days, and what the story is today with people being able to live and what feel like pretty normal lives, even if you may have to take medicine and to suppress the virus. What an amazing change that is. But it's a complicated legacy because of the future and who is going to pay for it all.
So there's an issue that you touch, which I want to follow up on. First of all, you were saying, culturally, and Malawians sort of like, it was like a transactional kind of partnership now that you have to do this and there's some kind of payment that needs to happen. So the issue of per diem, for instance, like whatever that needs to be done, they need to get a bit of something. So now you're evolving in your partnership to say, they do this part, I do that part. So, I mean, how easy was that to actually get to that point? Because you're not only just dealing with a personality now, this is something that a system needs to adopt,
Sure.
How were you able to make sure that what PEPFAR standpoint is and what they are requiring, to meet like the midpoint,
So I often say that if you want to ask me how I'd characterize my tenure in this work, my favorite label for myself is strategist. Like, I love the fact that what I've been able to most contribute to in terms of what we've built here is to be very strategic, never losing sight of the political piece, how we got this money, why we're here, while we are trying to elevate all of these policies and principles that people want to live by. So the first time my team, so we sat as a team inside the embassy, and people had all sorts of plans for how they were going to program this money. But I'd also gone and sat with Chris Kangombe, and his approach to it was very different. It was very systems focused. It was the things that you were going to need to deliver the services, as opposed to our team, who was like, okay, this is what we need to do for PMTCT. So my partners need this amount of money, and then they're going to do X, Y, and Z. And so then I had to figure out, well, how are these things going to actually talk to each other? And so my first thing was, well, we actually need to, this is supposed to be a partnership. So we need to actually consider how our partner, the government of Malawi, is actually considering this. Civil society was an interesting interlocutor because sometimes it felt that our job was bringing civil society and government together. It's like, no, that's the difference between us and you. You're all Malawians, right? So you have something in common. Yet at the same time, civil society wanted to hold government accountable for who was actually getting infected and were those people being served. But I couldn't present the plan we had because it didn't match priority-wise, right? And so I would find myself having to interpret and translate and basically being able to say, okay, so this is what the government is wanting to do, but how do I connect that to the HIV outcome that my Congress wants to see? And so one of the fights, in fact, was that we will do some of the things that you want us to do, government, but I want to see you reflect us in the national reviews. Because we would have these national health reviews, we didn't show up. I'm like, but we're here doing all this work, bringing all this resource into the country. How come we're not in the plan? Well, you're not in the swap. I said, no, that's not going to be the reason why, because we are contributing and it has to get counted. Because if it doesn't get counted, your Ministry of Finance, Treasury, they don't see it. Yeah. And in fact, that's still today some of the challenge with how we all do our work, because many of our ministries, they like their relationship with the donors. And Treasury and Finance are like, don't come talk to me about co-financing, whatever, because you all are in this private relationship with my Ministry of Health, to the point that they're returning money to me because you're doing so much for them. So that was a lot of our trying to figure out how our partnership framework agreement would get implemented. And government, if you ask them independently of us, could they say, oh, no, we endorsed this plan. It's got these aspects in it. It was one of the times where we actually did a lot of work together in the nursing sector, because there were so many different groups supporting the nursing sector. And that partnership framework process actually helped us start to be the convener. And I would say that's one of the biggest things that PEPFAR has done in the countries that it has worked in. It has offered a table to convene a dialogue around a very important thing that was happening, that was killing a lot of people. People were giving resources to make stuff happen. But it was also a lot of transactional costs for the country, right? This donor wants this donor. So we as PEPFAR, that was a lot of what we did in those days, was to convene a table that was actually one that people felt they could see themselves in, and they could have a conversation and probably impact some kind of change for the better.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I also wanted to just, talking about partnership, it's not only with just the government, you have civil society,
Sure.
You've touched on that, but also you have other donors, that have a plate. Was there any efforts to make sure that this pot has different ingredients or different monies that are coming in, making sure that, the money that's there is able to cover all the needs than to for one donor to cover one. Was there anything like, because I know that in countries it's something that they're struggling.
I think one of the hardest things was that a lot of the other donors wanted us to join the swap, because it made sense to them, right? We're putting budget supports into the government in this way. You guys are doing this other thing that seemed off budget. So we had some of that struggle to work ourselves through. And it was actually important. The minute there was a scandal, it was helpful, because it was like, you see, it's actually good to minimize your risks. If we were all in the swap, we'll all be going down right now. And so some of it was actually just out of practice. I mean, our government was not going to let us put money into the basket. It just wasn't the American way. So we weren't going to do that. It also offered flexibilities that, because once your money was in the system, it was often hard to follow it through, because you really needed a highly performing government to be able to say, these are the things I signed into, right? So ours was much more hands-on, which had its good things and it had its bad things, because it became very hard to for Malawi to own what it was we were doing, because we had so much, we were so hands-on. And so that was oftentimes a challenge. And I think it still remains a challenge about how we did the work we did to minimize some of our risks.
I see. So could you recall, like, with all of this struggle, trying to put a lot of things into place and, finding your footing as the coordinator, and relationships and systems and cultures. So what would you say was like your most evident achievements in Malawi, or during your tenure, either due to your direct maybe input as a strategy, or your team during your tenure?
So that's a very humbling question to ask, right? Because I didn't go to Malawi so I would be remembered. I went to Malawi to help bring change and do my part, because it's the country's own journey. I feel it's an incredible privilege to be a part of a nation's building effort, right? Because they had to stop the death and dying so that they could grow as a nation. And I think that when I was leaving Malawi, I said to my ambassador, I said, I hope that our successors don't come and try to build something in their own image, that they would pick up what they found and take it further. And I was very serious about that, because I felt that it was very easy for people to come into environments like this and sort of it's about your career, I'm going to make a name for myself and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think that part of the reason for some of the impact that I made while I was there, because I know I made impact, and I get to experience it today. I got to see that telling the truth to each other is so important. And when I go and talk to the team today, you know, it's always like they always want to have that. So we'll have a town hall, and the town hall, they get to ask anything. I get to have an exchange with them. And it's really based on truth, because when I look at Malawi, I see myself. I don't feel a foreigner in their midst. I will tell you, you know, a lot of the challenge of who gets impacted by HIV and AIDS, and some of the challenges that we confront today, whether it is anti-homosexuality acts in a Uganda, or all of that turmoil that is there in the background, being able to say, guess what? I don't really care who you want to sleep with, who you love, whatever. Our job is to make sure you have access. Our job is this virus who doesn't care. If you're a grandmother, if you're a man who has sex with men, if you're whatever, it's like, where's your CD4 cell? I'm getting in. Where's your T cell? Whatever, I'm getting in, right? And so the fight for me, the fight against HIV, I feel like it is not because I think, you know, we deserve to have terrible viruses so that we can learn something about ourselves, but it's a reflection of our world, and that either we all help so we can move forward together, but you can't pick and choose. You can't say the mother is worth saving, but that one is not worth saving because they're sleeping with someone I don't think they should be sleeping with. Or I'll save that one, but not that one. Why are you dressing like a woman? You're a man, you know, that kind of stuff. We get a lot of that in the mix. And so when I look back, it was always respect. I always had respect. I always felt that it was our privilege to be there and to participate. And I would remind people all the time, I said, when have you ever had a meeting with the Health and Human Services Secretary in America, of Health and Human Services, the equivalent of the Minister of Health? Do you have access to that person ever in America? When you are in Malawi or in any of these countries, and in the work we do, you are in and out of the minister's office like they were friends of yours, right? It's a very, very privileged opportunity that we have. And so I don't take that for granted. And I don't actually, it's really an interesting thing when you are part of bringing assistance to a space, that you not think that just because you're doing that work, you are better than people. And that was what was great about COVID, because COVID, I can't tell you how many times we were telling people, go get tested. And then it happened here. It's like, oh my gosh, we don't want to test either. It was like the great equalizer, COVID was. And it was like, it turns out the humans are all behaving the same. It didn't matter whether you were in the West or in Lilongwe, you didn't want to get tested. And it turns out we're all the same. Anyway.
So here you are in your office and you're leading this team. There's cultural divergence in different ways. And for you have found the sweet spot, how to navigate your way around to get what you want to do and implementation. How was your team like? Because I reckon you'd have like a team of new people also coming from the US, because I know that PEPFAR will bring a lot of experts.
Sure.
Were there any issues of integration and, dealing with the work ethic and the culture that really delayed maybe implementation?
Two stories. One of them was, and sometimes you have to experience something to know you need some better things. So somebody came, one of the agencies brought a new person in that threatened to upend what we had built there. And I took pride in the fact that we sorted our stuff out as a team in country, that we didn't go to the ambassador to go keep reporting people, nor did we bring our stuff to Washington. Like, it was important to me that we have a good reputation, because any potential we had of getting additional resources, which was a big agenda item of ours because we had so little money, Our interagency cred was a really important thing to me. So when this person came in and kind of created chaos, I wrote it was like a cable. When you would arrive in country, I would give you, and I would tell you who we were here. And then I would say, we're really glad you came, and we hope we're going to be better because you came. It was my positive way of saying, we're not going to put up with crap here. That stuff that might happen in other places, it's not going to happen here. So we had a really good reputation because we set a standard that's not actually how we do our stuff here. I think that's one thing. The second thing is, and this is such an important story, and I wouldn't name names, but I had a health office director, and then I had an HIV lead. Both were white people who came to Malawi. The folks at the NAC had a lot of challenges with the health office director. You know, they were constantly moaning to me, she's such a colonial this, that, and the other, she's treating us, whatever. And then her HIV advisor person came 2 years into our relationship. And just a very different personality. So I decided she's not coming with us, he's coming with us. And it was such a fantastic thing to really describe that actually our issues are not a color issue. It's just whether or not you know how to respect people and how to talk to people. The same people who, I'm like, it's the same agency. This one, the money whatever money he has access to, she has to allow it to happen, but just different styles. So we went further because we were able to build bridges with a different personality. So that was also another thing, just kind of watching who is the best person to be in some conversation. I'll tell you all the information you need to know, but not every single one of you is coming with me to a particular meeting, right? Because so much of the secret sauce is just the people. And actually, you know, if you get some of that right, then you can actually probably solve some of the harder things that are there to solve without all of this extra.
You tell such a rich story about interpersonal relations that really becomes like the heart of, you know, success in implementing projects, which is really something that it's not always very easy to glean out of people, but it's coming so naturally to you that almost all your conversations are just inclining to be like, you know, positioning yourself in the story, which is really nice. So I want to find out, like, within the embassy, because you have a structure, who are you reporting to every day, how frequent, and also your link to Washington to make sure that, you know, you keep on track with everything.
So it was one of the loneliest jobs in the world. It's ironic, for all of the amazing things, it was also incredibly lonely. And the reason why it was lonely is because you had many bosses. So you had the ambassador and the DCM. So I reported to the DCM. And then there was the ambassador in Washington in the office here. So he and his people, or she and her people, were also your overseers. And then there were your points of contacts in the agencies who were also watching out for their teams. So there were lots of people who wanted information, who wanted to influence. And the thing that was hard was that you developed a relationship with your team. You know, we met once a week, every week, to discuss what it was we were doing, to discuss instructions that had come from Washington, to discuss the priorities of the leadership in the embassy. And somehow it was your job to sort of keep all of this together. And there would be days where I knew that I had to go tell the team something from Washington, and it was going to be on me. We used to do our COP reviews in those days on the phone. We'd have 8-hour calls with Washington. And you are in a room in a conference call, they're in a room here in a conference call, nobody can see each other. And all I'm doing is muting the phone and begging people, can you respond? No, you talk to them. I don't want to talk. Can you, I mean, it was pretty challenging. We would have people come out on what we refer to as TDYs. And so it's not that people didn't come, but there was a lot of guarding the flock and trying to make sure that we were all paddling in the same direction. I think some of what would be very difficult was just people's natural instincts. There were the people who would get an instruction from Washington, and the first thing they would say, I still remember Beth Deutsch, she was one of those people who, as soon as something came, the first thing out of her mouth was, should we go to the ministry and talk to them? And then there'd be others like, why would we go? Let's figure out what we're going to do with the money first. Let's divvy it up amongst ourselves first. And then we're going to go talk to the ministry. So it was things like that of just teaching by modeling the right behavior that, yes, it may be our money, but it is their country. One of the things you'll never hear me say in my 18 years in PEPFAR is that I would be in a country and I would talk about their sites as our sites. Never. Never, ever does it stray from my mind for all of the money that we could bring in to do the work we do, that I don't forget that it is their country first. And so you were asking me earlier, in some of those, when things would get really like intense with me and different parties in the country, the Minister of Health, the first minister, she's deceased now, Marjorie Ngawunje, she was a politician when I got to country. And, I think she probably heard me in a meeting or so, and she summoned me one day at 4:00 to come to the ministry. And I was full of trepidation. I was like, and it turned out she just kind of like wanted to get to know who I was and whatnot. And so this started a tradition of hers. A lot of Fridays she would ask me to come. So the Gates Foundation came to country. They were actually trying to support medical male circumcision. And they came to country and they had a meeting with her, and she literally ran them out of the country. She was so mad. Like, what are you doing for the women? This, blah, blah, blah. So after all of this kind of like went down, when I had my private time with her, I said, Honorable Minister, I said, why did you do that? I said, you know what you should have done? You should have listened to their plan. Then you should take out your plan. Where's your plan? And you could have said, this is what I'd like to do. Instead, now they've gone, you don't have money. You don't have the project that you could have likely have shaped. But that was the kind of thing that we could do privately, right? I would never have conversations like that publicly, but you could actually build that kind of trust where you could actually say,
safe space.
Yes. Yeah. And I did a lot of that before we went into the meetings. I did a lot of backroom relationship building and just trying to figure out, so what is it that you're trying to do and how do we get there? And in the early days, when I was telling you earlier about trying to get our programs into the national review documents, I remember having this discussion one day, and it was like, okay, well, the way our work is all organized, we have these implementing partners and they get resources and then they go do these activities. And it was very clear to me that that wasn't a bridge building exercise, and that I needed to take that same information and organize it in the way that Malawi wanted to see it. So I stopped looking at our individual partners and instead combining their work and saying, this is what we're doing in this particular area. And that was a much more, the country tolerated that interpretation of us much better. Even though we had to provide the information in a different way to Washington, I figured out that how we talk about it here needs to make sense for here. And so some of those lessons are still relevant today. They're still relevant, not just in Malawi, in the many other countries that I've had the privilege of overseeing those programs. So we have this term, it's called the PEPFAR chair. So it's the person in Washington who basically helps support the effort in country. can talk about the work here, but can also go to country and be the opportunity to make peace, advance initiatives with the country team. So I've done that in many places, in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in the Dominican Republic, the Caribbean program, Central America program, Angola. I did Zambia. So I've had the opportunity to be in many places. I've also had work that I did with Vietnam, which was the first time that I was kind of coming out of Africa and going into Asia and wondering whether or not I could have that same kind of experience. And I remember flying into Hanoi and thinking, wow, this is going to be really tough. I don't know what it's like. I don't know the Vietnamese people. And I still remember the first meeting that I went to with their equivalent of the Minister of Health. And by the time the meeting was over, I was like, oh my gosh, everybody's the same. It doesn't matter if you're Vietnamese or you're Malawian. It was still the same, you know, negotiating with each other and trying to find common ground.
Interesting. Let's talk about now the role players outside of government. So you have civil society, you have faith-based organizations. I mean, what were your experience? Did you have a regular contact with them, like the kinds of work you were doing with them as PEPFAR?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things so today there are more formal processes that we use to bring stakeholders around the table, but the one of the things that I did a lot as a coordinator was use the national structures. So we had a very effective National AIDS Commission process, and a lot of all our stakeholders were around that table. And so while there might be a moment from time to time where you were meeting with Pastor Sembereka and kind of being able to understand a little bit some of what the faith community wanted, or trying to inspire them to use their religious services to help move prevention messaging, we also had that opportunity, and I think to this day it's one of the pleasant things about PEPFAR, that sometimes you have to tell people, we are the government too, because it feels sometimes like civil society feels like we're their friend, and we're both against their government, and it's like it's not quite true. What we're trying to do is actually build your relationship so we can get out of the way. We're only here because we're helping bridge this gap. But I think that, and I also want to give credit to the Global Fund, because I think the Global Fund really was at the forefront of formalizing the civil society having a legitimate voice at this table where resources were being determined. So UNAIDS has always had valued civil society. They have civil society on their board, on their program coordinating board. But that was a lot of also what me as the coordinator facilitated, so that we were in touch with everyone. We were the table was big, and making time to discuss things. Every now and then we'd have, some big scandal, child marriage related something, or, we had, like, I remember our first sort of like moment in the headlines around same-sex relations and trying to figure out, kind of like what role we could play, very much in the background, but really trying to keep that conversation about access open. But I would say always, civil society has always been a really crucial player in the work that we did, including in those days.
I see. Would you say there was a specific strategy for engaging, like faith-based, or it was really like lumped into the same basket as nonprofit?
No, faith-based. I think that, and I'm so happy that when I started this conversation, I told you just how instrumental the NAC director, Biswick Marley, had been. Because quite frankly, I copied so much of what he was doing right. And sometime later, somebody had said to me, do you know who you remind me of? And there had been a UNAIDS country director who had been in the country before me, who had also sort of like followed Biswick's steer. And so he was very instrumental in how I saw the value of groups, because when you first are starting this work, you don't understand the interactions, the dynamics. I found it very hard to comprehend the Malawian culture and being very religious. And then all of this like sexual activity, like I didn't get it. I was like, well, what in the world is happening in the churches? And then what are you doing in the communities? And just really, there was a woman at USAID who was there leading the Millennium Challenge Corporation's program. And Malawi was trying to get itself qualified to get an MCC grant. And I will never forget having a conversation with it, because there is a type of Pharisee-like attitude that you get when you first go into a country with the kind of work you're supposed to do, and it's very easy to think that, oh no, you got sent here to come and fix this and make it right. And I was going on and on about some corruption issue that had happened. And she stopped me. Her name was Martha something. And she said, the only reason you may not see some of this in America is because there are systems in place. It has nothing to do with the people. Everybody will do this if there's no accountability and if there are no systems. And I remember hearing that, sort of being checked by that, and then really trying to ask those questions about, well, why are certain things happening? Why aren't you doing your audit? Like, what exactly is the reason for it? And just kind of like beginning to say to people, these are the things that are missing that have led us to where we are right now. It's not because your people just want to steal, There's
an opportunity.
It was an opportunity. And so, anyway, I'm not quite sure if I've answered the question.
Yeah, you have. I think we're now getting into like COP, because it's one of the very important process for PEPFAR, which is an instrument really for budgeting, for informing what is important for the country. But before I want to get there, it's important to have effective partnerships and coordination and relationships. So we know that at some stage in other contexts, there will be like issues, interagency, IED, CDC, maybe you find that they're not working effectively together. So was this the case, your experience in Malawi or not, if you had to deal with that?
So we are a very fascinating construct. And I'll tell you my views because I got to participate in countries. This is now after I have been an in-country coordinator. I oversaw the program we had in Indonesia that was largely USAID only, and there was a small DoD program, vice what we had in Malawi and many of the large programs in Africa. And there was not conflict in Indonesia because there were not, you didn't have to negotiate with so many different players. And the military, they had their military partner. So it was really USAID's show to run. But what was different there was that not having the other agencies, you didn't have the same kind of push to try new things, to actually, I'd almost say the better part of competition, where you get to observe other people and that healthy part of it, right? Okay. The fact that the program has had its history of interagency conflicts is a pure human thing. It is about money. How much do you get? How much do I get? And the fact that the process that we've always used was to say, this is the country's resources, and you all figure out, which instruments you'll use to help the country deliver. If you ask me today what I would do, I would probably have thought of something different. It's so hard. I mean, it's very easy to have 20/20 hindsight and say all kind of fantastic things now. But one of the interesting things about the conversations we're having now is in countries where our resources are much smaller. So there wasn't even enough for you to really like squabble too much over stuff. And our approach has been more that we're coming to assist. We've got some resources, but we're not coming to run the show. The money is not that kind of money. Those places are having a much easier is probably too easy a word, but a conversation about how our efforts can be better institutionalized into country systems and country approaches. It's a much smoother conversation. In these places where for 20 years, that's been the norm, that you have implementing partners supporting sites all over the country. And now you're trying to say to the government, so how are you going to do some of this with your domestic resources? Or how are you going to use more of the local instruments to do some of this stuff? It's a lot harder. So our mechanism, which was money from the State Departments to the agencies, to implementing partners, then supporting countries, because that was an NGO, but it was an NGO model. That's how PEPFAR has operated these last 21 years. It was ripe for, some of this push and pull that has happened. But one of the things that I like to reflect on, having been in the arena for so long, is that out of all of that, deep connections and relationships that people formed because they were fighting for a worthy cause. I feel like the PEPFAR alumni feel like people who went to war together. And just the things that we have experienced, just the privilege, because that's what the money brought. It gave you privilege to experience something, to help bring life where there was not going to be life, and to be able to learn from each other and innovate together. I mean, I still remember when this whole conversation about, well, how are we going to reach the men? And people started to think on things and, well, why don't we actually create? I mean, I went to a site in Zambia in the middle of a marketplace where the men could leave their business and come and get services. You wouldn't even know it was there. That kind of creativity, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to go to a hospital. I'm not going to go wait with all those pregnant women, right? And trying to figure out ways that you bring services closer to where the men were working. That's some of what was the magic of PEPFAR. And I think it's really interesting for me to reflect on 21 years. I wasn't there for all 21, but I wouldn't change it for the world. I'm glad my path came this way, because it's been unbelievable privilege to get to participate in the things that we got to participate in.
Okay, let's talk about the actual COP itself.
Sure.
How did you make sure that it does become, I know that you had like your agents within the ministry, Biswick, I believe.
Biswick was in the NAC.
Was in the NAC. Mm-hmm. So somebody that you were working with, like piggybagging, like they would have like the four.
Okay, so let me just be honest with you. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to present what it was we were doing in any kind of different way. We did our COP ourselves. In those days, we did the COP ourselves.
Okay.
We had to go and do some presentation to the country. So yes, we had to go and explain because it was kind of like a requirement. But in those days, it was not joint planning. It's not that we had to do it. That's how we did it, right? We didn't, when you know better and you look back and you say, well, actually, people oftentimes don't know that when you start something, you know, you start with what it is you know how to do. So you guys are a team. They sent you a letter saying this is the resource. You have to put it in these constructs, and you're going to technical working group meetings and things like that. It's not that you're not participating in the country processes, but we were never going to go to the ministry and say, okay, so they've told us we have $21 million for the COP this year. What would you like to do first? That's not how it happened.
Okay.
That was not how it happened in those days.
Okay.
I'm not saying, now, I can only tell you my experience, right? Because you probably will talk to Adrienne and she'll tell you they did something different in Nigeria. But that wasn't how we did it. And we weren't equipped to, and it also took a bit of time for me to build trust with the team, because when I first got there, people saw me as their assistant. You go write that stuff. We had to write all these narratives for abstinence and behavior change programs, and what were we doing for palliative care and whatnot. We evolved. And in fact, that partnership framework process that was a real turning point for us in terms of what does it mean to jointly own something and actually do something together. Because the rub was the team always had an idea of what they wanted to do, which partner they wanted to fund for something, etc. So you were managing that dialogue internally. And so your preference was to actually cook your thing. And then you could go say to the country, okay, so this is what we're going to do with the resources that we have. So it was a mixture of maybe in some areas. I think that some of the places where change first started was with the folks in Ministry of Finance, and had a colleague, Madala, who was a really good interlocutor between the Ministry of Health and us. I think that was some of the first times we started to discuss, because we didn't buy drugs. We've never bought the drugs for PEPFAR in Malawi. It's always been with Global Fund resources. And so the Global Fund table, the CCMs, there was a lot of sort of sharing of information in that space, where there's a debate about what would happen with the Global Fund resources. And then PEPFAR would be asked, so can you cover increasing testing services over here and the like. Today, it's a very different story. Today, there is it's a much more consultative process. There is a lot more engagement because, you know, we meet once a quarter, sharing data and all this kind of stuff. So the way the COP is managed today is a very different process than those days. But it is still, and this is what I love about the deputy coordinator in Malawi, who is Malawian and one of the smartest colleagues that I've ever had, because she was an implementer, has a really good understanding. And she'd say to me, "Mommy, this is an American program." And it's true. It is true that the COP does articulate for you that we have gotten resources from our Congress. We've tried to align with the strategy that we told Congress we're implementing. We've organized the resources in a particular manner to help move the agenda that Congress is most concerned about. And sometimes once you've done all of that, it's very hard to then say, oh, by the way, does this work for you? I'm being a little facetious in my comment in that manner, but it's never been that I have a blank check and I'm going to convene the country and say, what should we do with it?
Okay.
It's not like that.
Okay.
It's never been like that.
And it seems to have worked, because clearly you have some results that
we've got plenty of results. We've got plenty of results. I think that, you know, the challenge for the discussion right now is that what should have happened these last 21 years, where there was growth in the domestic resources to care for the health sector in any given country, those resources haven't materialized. People are paying their debts and they're, you know, paying their civil service, and then there's not much left after. and the needs in the health sector. I think such an interesting thing because I don't work in other sectors. So I don't know how some of these other sectors do their business, right? But the health sector, there is so much knowledge, so many players, and there's a spotlight that's shone on. Is that the word? That you shine on all of these interventions and all the ways of working, and even how the information is organized, such that I feel like there's a lot being offered in terms of what you can do for the health of your people, but there isn't enough money to do it all. So then there's a lot of attention where there's money and the money is organized. So you see a lot of activity around the Global Fund, around PEPFAR, because the resources are so well organized. It drives, well, should you be doing this with it? I need it for this. And, can you, or right now there's a lot of like, it's too siloed. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's too siloed. There weren't programs to save the people's lives. People had to put programs in place. Build on that. Stop saying disintegrate that to build something else. Because you're not going to get the money to build something new in 2024. You have to be able to maintain the control you have. But what I would argue is that we have to do it we have to simplify some of it. We have to, for all of the things that make managing HIV so complex, and it is a complex disease to manage. It's not straightforward. The resources that came with PEPFAR made its management also complicated because you had the money. If you didn't have the money, like we didn't have the money in those early days in Malawi, we're going to give you your drugs. We're going to pray your blood's doing the right thing. Don't have time to really monitor that, but please stay on your drugs. Come get your next supply next month, and so on and so forth. Okay. I hope I'm going to get to be asked about some of the stuff I've said before you go put it into the universe. I know I haven't given you this form yet. I have to think about it. I'm just kidding.
I don't think so far you've said anything contentious, but anyway, we know that data is very important.
Yes.
Yeah, because it was the only way in which you could be able to report to Congress.
Yes,
to say this
very true. Yes.
This. What kind of systems did you put in place? How was it like to actually be able to set up those systems so that you?
It was pretty cool to watch a science be born. I remember the early days of strategic information. I was like, you're just making this stuff up. And then it became a discipline. And but it's very epi-driven. So for epidemiologists, the data in PEPFAR doesn't look strange because that's what epidemiologists did or do. I think it's like formalizing those systems and creating ways of recording that information. PEPFAR and data are one and the same. The program and its commitments to collecting the information on the things it did, and then trying to use that information to determine what it's going to do next is, nobody did data better than PEPFAR. And today, what is the challenging conversation is United States, if you didn't have this resource to gather this information, Malawi as a country, would I do what you do? And I definitely probably wouldn't do your 36 indicators. I might do 2. So that's I think people appreciate it. We were having a conversation with a Global Fund the other day, and people were like, "Oh, we're changing some stuff." And the first thing they asked us was, "But not the data, right? Because we all use your data." And even our country colleagues use the data, right? But it costs money to gather that data, and I think it's very much what has influenced PEPFAR's ability to tell the story, to show what the money did, and to basically say to people, this should not be what you perceive. You should look at the facts that the data give you. Even if the data is not the cleanest thing, the thing is there's so much of it, you can follow trends and you can follow, there's so much you can do even without the cleanest of data to basically learn whether or not you're heading in the right direction. So what are you doing for women 24 through 29-year-old and or for the 15 to whatever age group? There's so much that has come out of that. But I also think that in all fairness, we have to figure out what the compromise is going to be. Because without a doubt, I can say to the minister, well, we would like to be able to continue to collect the information that we collect. And she will say, but I have 10 other things to do. I don't think I can dedicate like this, right? And so where's the balance? What's the future? And is PEPFAR going to be here forever? And so there's some very important conversations to have, particularly in places where you have dropped your deaths due to HIV/AIDS. And I was describing to someone this week, I said, we talk about the 25 million lives that are saved. So when you look at the global epidemic curve, there's a lot of money that you're trying to keep those 25 million people alive, right? The story isn't that they're dying and the curves are up here. You've actually saved their lives. But you don't have a vaccine, you don't have a cure. So how do you track your progress? How do you track that the pandemic isn't reversing course and that there's a new generation of people being infected? And so there's some really serious things for the program to consider in terms of how it does its work moving forward.
Okay, good with that. I think I'm going to transition to your most recent role.
Sure.
So I've seen like that you have been second in command in the OGAC office. I mean, how has that been for you now working in the headquarters of PEPFAR vis-a-vis your field experience, and how has that experience enhanced what you get to change, from the brain of PEPFAR, if I may say?
Wow. Huge. So I know this is my oral story, but I have to start and say there have been many of us who have walked through the halls of this space, and but I'm very fortunate because I had some terrific mentors and I had some people who felt that I had something special to offer. And but it's always been service. My parents were in public service. My father was a physician. My mother was a nurse. Some of my earliest memories are of my mom trying to stop, circumcision of young girls, and, being in the middle of screaming and saying, you guys need to stop this. The example of my life was parents who, this is what they did. They served. And I feel like God took care of the rest. I would be absolutely dishonest if I didn't tell you that my faith is a driver of my life. I don't think it's an accident that I was born of the continent and I ended up doing this kind of work. And the love of the land that I live in and the land that I came from, and trying to bridge the gap between people, I see that as a privilege and an honor to have done this kind of work. I think that I remember Eric Gooseby saying something to me when we were doing his farewell, and I was standing next to him, and I said, well, oh my gosh, who's gonna fill your shoes for me? And he goes, no, it's your turn now. And it was a bittersweet moment, but I remember thinking to myself that, well, you know what Eric and others did for me, I have to do for others too. And so I tell people all the time, if they're outside my office door and they're cowering, I'm like, do not ever treat me like that. The office may have a title. Yes, I'm asked to do a certain role, but I'm still Mamadi. And I always want to be grounded in Mamadi. And so I have definitely learned to adjust because this is a political office, and every 4 years there's a moment, and there will be some change. No matter what happens, there's always change. And so learning to not take possession of the things that I'm helping shape and steer, it was a lesson for me. I told you earlier how Ambassador Gooseby brought me here. Since he brought me here and I served under him, there have been 2 global AIDS coordinators. And I have learned to adjust to a house that you feel you own, and then you get new owners, but you don't move out, and they move the furniture around, and at first it's very jarring, and then you're like, oh, okay, this is the rhythm of the space. And so it's been important to be flexible. It's been important to let new leadership say, this is the vision I have, and then you support that vision. And I feel very much, last year I had the privilege of meeting President Bush, and I told him, I said, I feel like you should have known me a long time, because I've been working my butt off for your effort. And I was half joking. I was also thrilled to meet him, because so much of my life has been in service of this work, right? And but I don't ever lose sight of that. It's such an honor to be passionate about a mission. I feel like I definitely feel that this program is a reflection of our better selves. It's a compromise. PEPFAR is a compromise. And this is not my word. This is a colleague from the women's group last year saying, where we are is a compromise. And I know exactly what she means, because around this effort, they're the Bible beating people. They're the people who are like, oh my gosh, you all are too conservative. There's this group. And how in the world can all of those people come around something and actually steer it forward? I'm like, well, that's actually what our world should be, that our world should be that, right? And we figure out how to meet in the middle, because we're doing it in service of you and your life. And it's not important to me to take on responsibility of whether or not I like the way you're behaving, are you a sex worker? None of that stuff is what I think about first. Not in this space. In this space, it's like, yeah, we're trying to defeat something here. And in the path of trying to defeat the impact of this pathogen, whoa, so much we have learned about ourselves. So much. I think about those days in Malawi when we used to go visit those childhood-headed households. When I look back at that, and I think those children, unbelievable resilience, right? You are now in charge of your younger siblings. I mean, I don't even know how they did it, how they survived that. Those are the things we saw. I remember when we did palliative care programs, and to be able to say, look at that, we actually had a budget code for palliative care. But because of life-saving therapy, people are not, it's not that you don't still need palliative care. Last year, I lost my brother. I got to see palliative care in action. But there's so much less need for that because people are taking their drugs, suppressing the virus and not transmitting it at the rate that they once were. So it's been just such a privilege for me. This is how I pay my mortgage, coming to work here. It's not lost on me. But my husband, one day we were around the table and he said to my girls, he said, you want to know how much your mother loves her work? He says, who gets up at 4:15 in the morning and they're just so excited to go to the office? Who does that? But I think I know why I do that. I do it because every day you feel the impact of this effort. And it's been a good thing. It's been a good thing. It's not a perfect thing, but it's been a good thing for the world that this program happened. And Admiral Zimmer told me in 2016 when I was talking about, we're trying to routinize this and routinize. He says, don't ever try to routinize PEPFAR or PMI or MCC. He says all of those special things that happen, You all guard that and just let them do their thing as opposed to trying to make it normal. So I don't try to make PEPFAR normal. I think that the things that are hard about it, and there are things that are hard about it, are part of why we've gotten this far. You can say to the US Congress, you invested that much money and you saved a generation. And that is not a small feat. And we did it without going to war and having weapons of, whatever.
I think you just took my last question.
Oh, good.
Because departing message, like what the future is, what should PEPFAR be cognizant of, what really matters. I think you have summarized that compromise, like being able to not change things and keeping the momentum of what's working and all of that. I mean, unless there's a last departing thing that you want to say, which you have not touched on, but otherwise.
The only thing I would say I haven't touched on is that this is a two-way street. And so what we've talked a lot about today is what PEPFAR is and, the things we did with that instrument. What we need on the other side is political commitment from the countries that have benefited from this program, that they are able to take the gift of what it was and basically say, we too can do better for our citizens. I'm not saying that governments are not doing things for their citizens. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that this is an external effort, and we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a cure, and the lives have to be sustained. And so we need the political commitment for what it is PEPFAR came and did to ensure that people's lives continue to be saved.
There was an issue about reauthorization.
Sure.
Now that's going on. I mean, would you have anything, if you were to tell Congress, what would you say about reauthorization of PEPFAR and what's going on at the moment?
So reauthorization of PEPFAR is not about appropriating money for the program. It is the promise that for a period of time you can count on the United States to actually help you sustain what you've done. Because we didn't do this, we all did it together. And everything that PEPFAR has done well, it has done well because the 5-year authorization period gives you time. It's near impossible for you to run a program of this scale on a year-by-year basis. You put tools together, you help governments do some predictable thinking over a period of years about what it is that will be available to help support them in these efforts. I think it was a big surprise that PEPFAR found itself in the political moment that it found itself in 2023. I don't think anyone could have predicted that because it's done so much good. But it's a very different world that we're living in right now. And because the world around us is changing, PEPFAR and those who benefit from the program have to be smarter about thinking on this and planning on this. I'm hopeful that we will get that support through 2030 to basically say, okay, guys, you will be here, you will have this tool, so get working about how you're going to come 2030, be able to continue to support people who are going to need this life-saving therapy. The irony for me about being a scientist as well, I know that when you look at various treatments that have come, various vaccines that have come, typically you don't fight for 25 years to find a vaccine and then you kind of find it. I don't know that we'll ever get one. Like the billions that NIH has spent on HIV research, other countries have spent trying to figure out, and I know there was all this hope with the COVID vaccine because it was an mRNA vaccine. Will this teach us something about HIV? And I want to remain hopeful from that sort of like scientific wonderness space. But one of the smartest viruses ever known to man is HIV. And I feel like it is our conscience on some level as humanity that you will, the Bible has a verse that says, the poor you'll always have amongst you. And I'm like, really, God? Like, we're going to be poor forever, some of us? Is HIV going to be something like that, where you're not going to forget what happened when I was out of control? You're going to try to keep me under control. You're going to try and figure out how your young people don't see a lifetime of taking medicine. Hopefully they'll have injectables that people can have 3 times a year or something someday. But that is not a status that we want to maintain. But it's really hard. Everything else, you can just go and get your annual shots and then you don't have to worry about it, right? But this one, it's like you're constantly having to be on your guard, and it's hard for the humans to be on their guard. Totally. Yeah. And so out of a moment that was really terrible, I think the humans on the whole have done really good things with trying to change the condition and make life better for people. And so if my parting word to you is this, it is that my image of PEPFAR is always as a ship. And I would always see it that way. The PEPFAR is just too large to sink. And a few months ago, I got to visit Mercy Ship, and the ship was enormous. 12 floors. It had like a conference room, like a conference center on it. It had theaters to do surgeries, all sorts of things. And as I was walking through on my tour, I said to myself, this is what PEPFAR is. It's just so vast. It's so complex. It's got roots in so many places. And I hope it's a tool that will deliver for HIV, and it will be a tool for other things, right? In the future. So I hope it never goes away. One day my time will be done doing this work, because that's just the nature of life. And but I know what I want to tell you. So I went when we first started going back to meeting after COVID. There was a convening of civil society in Senegal, and then President Macky Sall hosted this high-level event, and there were a number of side events and different kinds. It was about HIV. It was about civil society's role, and and what happened at the end. So I got sent to represent our office, and we had a bunch of dignitaries there: Peter Sands and the French ambassador, Winnie Byanyima from UNAIDS. So when the event was over, there was a reception, a very private reception with President Macky Sall, but nobody had told me this was happening. So I was kind of like making my way out of the venue with the crowds, and all of a sudden, some security people and some people who were they came to get me. And I walked into the room, and they told me, no, there's a reception with the president. Everybody's supposed to be there. So I go in this room, and there are probably like 14 people. It was very small. And I walk in, and President Macky Sall goes, "Madam PEPFAR." And I was like, that is so apt. I'm going to call myself Madame PEPFAR from now on, because I am the grand dame of PEPFAR or something like that. But it was such a great moment, because I was like, hey, even he recognized, no, that's the madam from PEPFAR. So
that's attribution right there.
Well, thank you.